coming up.
I mean, now we've got 11 people who have been identified as either wittingly or semi-wittingly having been assisted by hostile states. We don't know their names. If light is the best disinfectant, and we have been slow to react when it comes to foreign interference, I think we can agree on that. Are we not just perpetuating the exact same pattern of the government, and this goes right to the highest level because the decision is with the Prime Minister, are we not just perpetuating that more and more by failing to act?
Well, you indicated that perhaps it's not the role of government, but there were structures and processes in place at the time of the 2021 election. I would note that in May of 2021, an IMU was sent to the Minister of Public Safety that specifically noted that Kenny Chu's writing was of high interest to the PRC.
We're talking about misinformation here, and the need to trust, who we can trust, worried about what we see online. But here we have CTV News. We all know who CTV News is, and they created a statement. They spliced together multiple sentences to say something that the leader of the opposition did not say. Conservatives were calling for a carbon tax election. They made it about something else.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
I've already said good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone, to hour number 2. I expect that we are going to have two full rounds on this one. And I would like to welcome our witnesses for the second hour. From Disinfo Watch, Mr. Marcus Kolga, who is the director. Mr. Kolga, welcome to committee. I know we had a bit of an issue last time, but we worked it out, and we're so pleased to have you here with us today. And from MILA, which is the Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, we've got Joshua Bengio. I hope I said that right, sir. Founder and scientific director. These for 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here. It's appreciated to take time out from your schedule, especially when we're dealing with something so important. Now, I'm going to focus my time with Mr. Kolga. And I've reviewed your testimony, and I'm not sure if our two witnesses, whether they were online for the last round. I'm not sure. Can anybody just give me a thumbs up, yes or no? Nope, they were not? Okay. So I apologize. I'm going to cover some ground that I covered during the last round. Now, Mr. Kolga, I'm going to present some things I think are probably fairly straightforward. I've reviewed your prior testimony. I've reviewed the testimony of a former colleague of ours, Kenny Chu, as well, when it comes to foreign interference, because to me, that is one of the central issues of misinformation and disinformation. Obviously, it's my view, and I hope you will agree, Mr. Kolga, that government has what we would say in law is an obligation to prevent electoral interference, and that obligation starts from the bottom at Elections Canada and any other enforcement agencies and goes right up to the top to the Prime Minister. We've got agreement on that, I take it?
Yeah, in principle, yes, I agree.
Of course. Yep. I'm not trying to trap you or anything. It's fairly, to me, that's really trite. The reality is most of us have worked very hard to get here. It's not easy. So when there is interference in an election and there is uncertainty as to whether or not it affected the election, I'm talking about both on the national level and on the riding level, that's going to be a win for any hostile state actors that are intervening, correct?
Yeah, I would agree.
The fact that we're even talking about this, it shows that the intervention itself was to some degree successful. Is that right?
To a degree.
Yep.
Maybe.
So, okay, fair enough. Clearly, there was foreign interference in the election in Richmond-Stevenson. Stevenson East. Oh, thank you. The government knew about this, and they did nothing. Now, at what point should we, as Canadians, At what point should the government be acting? Should they not be acting immediately and informing Canadians by shining the light on this? Because that is what the best disinfectant, the best anecdote, if you will, or antidote, I should say, to electoral interference and the misinformation that comes with it?
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I should note that at Disinfowatch, we were made aware of these efforts about 2 to 3 weeks into the writ period. And it took us maybe 4 or 5 days to analyze the data that we received from various different sources, including sources within the Chinese community in Canada. And we produced an election alert that we posted to our website about a week and a half before Election Day. And so, I think that as a civil society organization, as an independent civil society organization, we have the ability to act a little bit more nimbly and quickly. Now, did that alert prevent the interference from happening? No, I mean, it had already happened at that point. I don't know, whether we were able to have any impact, but I think that in future elections, the government and the organizations that are being set up inside of that to monitor elections should be much more quick to report instances of interference in the election. There are very simple ones instances that could have been reported quickly, including the Global Times piece that was published in Chinese state media attacking the Conservative Party and its leader, Mr. O'Toole. That could have been reported very quickly. So I would think that in future elections, we need to improve those timelines to get that reporting out there. Any sort of instances of interference, efforts to interfere in our elections should be reported much more quickly than they were during the last election.
Well, certainly, and I mean now we've got 11 people who have been identified as either wittingly or semi-wittingly having been assisted by hostile states. We don't know their names. If light is the best disinfectant, and we have been slow to react when it comes to foreign interference, I think we can agree on that. Are we not just perpetuating the exact same pattern of the government, and this goes right to the highest level because the decision is with the Prime Minister, are we not just perpetuating that more and more by failing to act in this instance right here, right now?
Well, I would agree. I think at all levels, I've been advocating for quite some time for greater transparency when it comes to collaboration with foreign governments, especially authoritarian foreign governments. And I think C70 will go a long way to helping along with that. So yes, I mean, I
apologize for cutting you off. I just want to end with this quote, and this is from Kenny Chu. This is what he said at Foreign Interference on April 30th, 2024. What I heard during the hearings shook that up a little bit because it looks like there are some Canadians who are more valuable and worthy of protection than others. And I hope that every Canadian, regardless of what party they run with, is worthy of protection in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Caputo. And Mr. Kolga and Mr. Bengio, short period of time here for questions, 6 minutes. Oftentimes, members will reclaim their time, maybe cut you off before you're able to answer, but it's the members' time. They're just trying to maximize that, so don't take it personally, please. I've got Ms. Khalid.
Now, one thing that I think is quite clear with misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and its role by state actors and non-state actors is, I think, the point that the strength of any country, any state, are its people. And that whole war using misinformation, disinformation to create disruption, to create agitation, and to undermine the democracy of a state like Canada is troubling, and it leaves a lot of the communities that are impacted very vulnerable. I'll start with Mr. Kolga. You had mentioned about local influencers that were used to amplify messages for you, and you had used Russia as an example, but I'll also say that we've seen stories, articles of Indian influencers that have called upon the government of India to put in money into political parties here in Canada to ensure that a certain political party wins the upcoming election, for example. We've seen Russian bots trying to influence a certain political party and its perception here in Canada as well. How do we regulate that? How do we hold people to account while also maintaining the sensitivity around local communities that become victims on both sides of the situation ultimately?
Well, thank you so much for that question. Ultimately, it comes down to, we have C-70 in place now, ensuring that is implemented properly to ensure that we are enforcing the legislation that's already in place. I mentioned during my opening remarks that we have Canadians who were directly working with RT. The U.S. DOJ indictment about that case clearly indicated that Canadians received payment into Canadian bank accounts. The timelines that were presented in that indictment would indicate that those payments were made during a period where RT was under Canadian sanctions. So services were delivered to RT and payment was made from RT to Canadian bank accounts. That to me would indicate a potential violation of our sanctions legislation. My question would be then, what is the Canadian government doing about that? Is there an investigation into sanctions violations, and are we going to enforce the legislation that we already have in place? Because if we don't do that, that will send a message to all of these foreign regimes that do engage in foreign influence operations and information operations that it's the Wild West. They can do anything in this country. So we need to begin right now by enforcing the current legislation that we have in place.
Thank you very much, and I will continue down that line. What is the responsibility of political parties in this? For example, the Conservative Party was recently targeted with Russian bots, for example, to lay claim that a rally happened or had however many people attend that rally, etc. What is the accountability then or responsibility on the Conservative Party, for example, and I'm just using them as an example, there are examples across all parties on this, to make sure that they're not victims or targets, whether witting or unwitting, of this kind of interference?
So, Mr. Chair, I should clarify one point. That there's been research into that instance that was mentioned about the allegation about Russian bots supporting the Conservative Party about a specific rally. That's been proven to be untrue. In fact, those bots were, according to researchers at McGill University, they were experimental. A student was just playing around with bots and happened to latch on to that specific case. So. I think that any sort of blame that's been laid or any allegations regarding the Conservative Party or even Russians in that case should be discounted. That did not happen. But of course, I think all parliamentarians have a moral obligation to reject any sort of disinformation and misinformation, not to engage in the use of it. I think that more needs to be done in terms of educating parliamentarians. I strongly support annual training for all parliamentarians and their staff on misinformation, disinformation, and influence operations, what they look like, so they're able to detect them when they see them, when they run across these sorts of narratives. That's very important. I would also, and I've long advocated for the creation of a committee inside Parliament where representatives of each of the major political parties is in attendance, and they get briefed on a weekly, bi-weekly basis on emerging narratives so that everyone is on the same page, and so as to avoid anyone mistakenly, inadvertently amplifying some of these narratives. So I think those are a couple of fairly simple steps that we can take to help parliamentarians, because I do believe that most parliamentarians, I would say all parliamentarians, want to do the right thing and fulfill that moral obligation in not amplifying these sorts of narratives.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate you clarifying. I'll turn to Mr. Bengio for a quick second. You spoke about the use of artificial intelligence. Now, there was a recent article talking about deep fake of Justin Trudeau used for passive income ads. So it was a video by...
We're over time, but quickly, I'll let you...
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, Chair. So my question to you really is... are we talking about just state actors or non-state actors with respect to foreign interference? And as Mr. Kolga had already said, like, you know, there's a whole bunch of different things that are going on here. It's not just one entity that's operating.
S'il vous plaît, Monsieur Bengio. Sorry, we're like 28 seconds over. Monsieur Bengio, rapide réponse, s'il vous plaît.
Just to say that those tools are very easy to use. A kid could do it on their laptop. So you don't need to be a state actor for using deepfakes. Some of the things I've been talking about with using bots for persuasion, that's more advanced. But as everything gets more advanced, it's going to be easier for people who are not even state actors and terrorists to use this.
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Villemure, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Bengio. Now we are going to Mr. Green, who's going to have the next 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, and welcome to the guests. One of the, I think, privileges we have as members is to engage with subject matter experts. Mr. Bengio, I know that you are certainly that. So I do have some questions following up from my good friend, Mr. Villemure. We seem to be on the same wavelength. Given the increasing accessibility of technologies capable of producing deep fakes, as you referenced in synthetic media, what specific regulatory measures would you recommend to safeguard democratic institutions in Canada from the potential weaponization in spreading misinformation and disinformation?
Unfortunately, there is no silver bullets. So it's going to be a lot of little things. And unfortunately, a lot of the power to reduce those risks is in the hands of the Americans. So it could be the federal government or California, these days. But there are things that I think the Canadian government can do. First of all, one of the most important things is those companies building those very powerful AI systems need to do tests that, for example, the UK and US AI safety institutes are helping with, that try to evaluate the capabilities of these systems. So is the AI, like, how good is the AI at doing something that could be dangerous for us? So it could be generating very realistic, imitations, or it could be persuasion that I mentioned. I think is one of the things that we haven't seen yet used that much, but I think I'd be surprised if the Russians are not working on it, using open source software. And so we need to know, basically, if you were in, yourself a bad actor, how could you use the systems that are commercially available or downloadable open source in order to do something dangerous for us? And we need to evaluate that so that first we basically force the companies to mitigate those risks or even prevent them from putting out something that could end up being very disruptive.
In your opinion, and I think you'd referenced this about how because it's not necessarily a commercially viable research tract, that nation states are going to have to invest in this to give immunity. I think about this in some ways as a form of defense spending, as a form of national defense spending.
Yes.
What opinion do you have, if any, around the possibility of creating international regulations, for example, treaties that would deal with specificity around AI and would, of course, provide some kind of international pressure or culpability should there be evidence of state actors? And I'll let you answer that first, and then I'll ask my follow-up.
Yes, turns out I'm very much involved in these kinds of efforts in the international community. I'm chairing an international panel modeled more or less after the IPCC, but for AI safety. I'm also involved with the UN and the OECD on discussions about harmonization and coordination of AI regulation and treaties. There's still a long way to go. And it's also important that each country moves forward. So we have a proposed bill here in Canada, and we should do our share. It's very similar in spirit to some of the things that the Americans have done with the executive order, or what the Europeans are doing with the AI Act. And then we need to play a very important role on the international scene, because Canada, being a medium power, is in a way less threatening than the U.S., which also has very strong commercial interests. I think we can agree more easily with the Europeans, for example, and even with developing countries that also have issues with the way things are progressing. So I think we can really play an important positive role, also in the kind of geopolitical battle that's coming along between the U.S. and China, which is not making things easy to find international solutions.
But on that, and I hear often we have kind of a digital axis of evil. We talk about China, we talk about Russia, we talk about India sometimes. Is it not safe to say all countries are engaging in this in some form or another, and that it's often a matter of degrees of rhetoric about what is an influence campaign and having, international influence versus international interference? So going back to this idea of treaties, of internationally recognized law established, you've mentioned the United States and Europe. Are they not also involved in this? And if so, is the regulations that they're putting forward only considering the short term and domestic interest?
I think there are red lines. There are ethical red lines. We do have, legal protection in countries that don't exist in other countries. And so there are differences. But you're right. Everyone's trying to use technology to their advantage at different degrees. We should make sure that we have more transparency in how these tools are used, whether it is by corporations or by state actors like our governments. Eventually might be tempted to use AI in order to influence their own people. And we need to have guardrails against that as well. Of course, we need to protect against state actors that are clearly intent on destabilizing our democracies. But you have to think in a few years from now, maybe a decade, I don't know, we're going to build machines that are going to be as smart as humans. At least it's very plausible, and the majority of AI researchers think we're gonna get there.
Okay.
How is that going to be used? And there's a chance that there's going to be an abuse of that power by whoever controls these machines.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for the indulgence.
Yep, no worries. We are going to the second round now, starting with Mr. Cooper for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kolga, when you appeared before the Procedure and House Affairs Committee back in November 2022 as part of its study on foreign election interference, you gave testimony, and I asked you some questions about Beijing's disinformation campaign in Steveston, Richmond East. Since then, a lot of new information has emerged from the public inquiry and in other fora, including this committee. Last week, the Office of the Commissioner of Canada Elections tabled a report at the public inquiry on foreign election interference. The report confirmed that the PRC targeted former MP Kenny Chu in Steveston, Richmond East, as part of a disinformation campaign designed to drive voters away from him, using fairly sophisticated efforts, including through the amplification of such disinformation on social media platforms. Madam Justice Hogue, in her initial report back in the spring, noted that, quote, there is a reasonable possibility that these narratives could have impacted the result in this riding. In other words, the disinformation was significant enough that it could have tilted the balance in terms of the outcome of the election in that particular riding, resulting in the defeat of Mr. Chu. I find that alarming. Do you? It seems to me it should sound the alarm of how serious the threat of foreign interference from hostile foreign states, including the PRC, is to our democracy and the integrity of our elections.
Well, I have no doubt that that operation did impact the result. Now, whether it tilted the result one way or the other in any significant way, we don't know that. But there's no doubt that it had some form of impact. What to do about this in the future? Again, I will go back to my statement earlier. We tried to raise the alarm about that operation as it was happening, or shortly after we observed it happening. This is something that needs to be done in the future. And I think that I'm not sure that it's the government necessarily that has a role in doing that, but certainly empowering civil society organizations, those that are monitoring the information space, who understand it, who understand where to look, to empower those groups and individuals who are doing that work so that they can alert Canadians, Canadian media, to those sorts of efforts when they're happening. That will help build resilience and strengthen our democracy.
Well, you indicated that perhaps it's not the role of government, but there were structures and processes in place at the time of the 2021 election. I would note that in May of 2021, an IMU was sent to the Minister of Public Safety that specifically noted that Kenny Chu's writing was of high interest to the PRC. That IMU went into a black hole. The minister claims he never saw it, even though it went to himself, then Minister Blair, his chief of staff, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety. Following the Global Times article on September the 9th of 2021, the Rapid Response Mechanism at Global Affairs Canada highlighted the disinformation that was being spread. That was provided to the election committee that had been set up by the government to counter foreign interference and to bring awareness to interference activities. And through it all, Kenny Chu was left to drown in a sea of disinformation. And not only did he drown, in fact, there is evidence that the Liberal Party actually amplified the disinformation being spread by the Beijing-based regime. So not only is it the case that the PRC intervened in the Steveston-Richmond East election or riding, but one of the major political parties, namely the Liberal Party, actually amplified the disinformation, perhaps resulting in the defeat of Kenny Chu. So would you agree that the system failed Kenny Chu and failed the voters of Steveston-Richmond East?
I'm going to have to ask you to do this very, very quickly, Mr. Kolga, please.
Well, I would absolutely say that there's room for improvement within that system to ensure that when these instances are detected in upcoming elections, that they are brought to the attention of those individuals who are being targeted. And that goes beyond elections. That goes to those spaces between elections, when whether it's elected officials, candidates, activists are being targeted by information operations, they need to be notified. So there's lots of room for improvement.
Good. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Baines, for 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us on this very important study. And I'm going to draw your attention to C70. Are you familiar with the motion 112 that was introduced in the House also? So what we're talking about here is information, and some important recommendations came out of this study. And I mean, the misinformation piece, what Mr. Cooper ended with in his question there was misinformation. The Liberal Party did not amplify the claims that he's talking about. So, and we've seen evidence of him drawing different conclusions earlier in this study today as well. But I will, I'll stick to the important matters here, that the solutions and what you're talking about in terms of, what can we do better? So the issue of information that's being shared, we look at the Security of Information Act, and it was in fact a former director of CSIS that came into the study, talked about how important it is to use that as an enforcement tool. It's something that, when I talked about M112, sharing information with hostile nations, some agreements that we already have existing, that needs to be reviewed. That was one of the M112s. That was what Motion M112 was. It was something I co-authored with MP Dollywall. And we look at, if you can expand on how important Security of Information Act is, if within your knowledge, scope of knowledge on that, and the fact that it hasn't been updated for over 20 years, and what impact can that have?
Well, I think it will have a tremendous impact if it's properly implemented, and again, if it's enforced. That update in C70 to the Security of Information Act will go a long way to helping defend vulnerable communities, activists, journalists, and of course parliamentarians who are being targeted with transnational repression. So I think that's positive. I think that the update to the CSIS Act, the fact that the update will allow CSIS now to communicate with non-governmental organizations where it's relevant, perhaps to warn individuals and groups when they are being targeted by these sorts of operations, to let civil society organizations know when they detect these sorts of operations, so that we can be better prepared to defend Canadian democracy and society against them. That's a major improvement. And of course, as part of C70, we also saw the adoption of the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry, which is also going to be critically important. The implementation of which we'll have to keep an eye on. But this will be also, it's an incredibly important measure in defending against these sorts of operations in the future. And I hope that that legislation will be implemented very quickly and that it will be enforced.
I'm going to take another question, a different question, different path. Do you think there needs to be more vigorous sort of back checking on, say, members who are interested in running for office, who may have previous relationships with foreign entities, foreign countries? An example, in 2020, the member who is now the current member for Calgary Heritage, he helped produce a controversial report by former CBC reporter Terry Molesky, alleging Pakistan secretly created a Sikh separatist movement. And this report was then amplified by official Indian government accounts. And then later, the same member led the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's partnership with the New Delhi-based Observer Research Foundation. It's an Indian think tank set up with funds from Indian oil giants, and now is a member. Do we need to look at some relationships members like this may have with previous governments who are now showing hostilities and interference here domestically?
Well, absolutely. I think any candidates at all three levels of government, that process of vetting them should be far more rigorous. Absolutely. I don't think that anyone would have anything against greater transparency as part of that process. So I would completely support that.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
5 seconds, Mr. Baines.
Thank you for your testimony today. It's very valuable.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bengio, I've heard folks familiar with AI downplay some of the comments around what the potential is, but you've touched on some things, and I want to talk about technological singularity, or the idea that there's a point in time in the future when technological growth becomes uncontrollable and irreversible, resulting in kind of unforeseeable consequences. What are your thoughts on that? Is that an overstatement of the possibility, or is that something we should be aware of?
Let me put it this way. Nobody has a crystal ball. The AI researchers, I think as you alluded to, disagree among themselves about the different scenarios. And so the rational way of thinking about this is there are different scenarios. Some are incredibly fantastically good, and others are terrible. Eventually, people talk about human extinction. And many things in between. And so what is the responsibility of public policy here? Is to invest to make sure we see through this fog better as we move forward, and to make sure we avoid the catastrophic cases where there it's risks of upending our democracies or even creating monsters that could turn against humans. All of these, there are like computer science arguments explaining how it could happen. And if I had more time, I could.
Well, you can certainly send them to us, but I have about a minute 30 left. So I want to ask, with some specificity, given your subject matter expertise, we spoke about the international obligation Canada has. I want to now turn domestically to regulation. I do believe government has a role to play. There's not a free market answer to this because obviously free markets will incentivize some of the worst basic behaviors. So with AI and ethics and accountability, how can we develop an ethical framework for AI developers to ensure accountability when AI technologies are used to propagate disinformation, particularly in the context that can impact democratic processes?
So I think we can look at what has been done, proposed recently in California, where the way to make sure companies are going to behave well with these systems is through transparency and liability. And these are really great because the government doesn't need to specify what they have to do. Transparency because now they're showing more of what they're doing in terms of making sure those systems aren't going to be dangerous, and they want the public to look at them positively. And liability because now they have to be honest about potential harms that they could create with those systems, like the third parties could create, right? So it's not that one of these companies is going to do something directly to harm people. But if they make it easy for terrorists to do something or to create a monster, as I said, that may have huge costs for society, and they should understand that they're going to be financially responsible for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bengio. Mr. Barrett for 5. Go ahead.
I want to provide the witnesses with some context about a situation that's unfolded over the last week. On September the 22nd, CTV News aired a segment about a confidence vote that was going to come before the House. And in that segment, CTV deliberately misrepresented the comments of the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. Now, this is incredibly serious. So we're talking about CTV News. They're owned by a media giant in this country. They're owned by Bell. And what happened is shocking. So CTV News spliced together different parts of the leader of the opposition's comments to create a false impression. Well, first of all, created a false statement, something that he never said. But the intention was to create a narrative that the opposition day motion was not about having a carbon tax election, which was what it was about, but was instead that it was to oppose the Liberals' dental care program as opposed to it being about the carbon tax. And this isn't a situation where we have an error, a misunderstanding during the editing process, or some kind of technical issue. This isn't something that can be communicated away. This was very clearly an effort by a media company, by a news organization, to manipulate the statements of the leader of the opposition on the eve of a confidence vote in the House of Commons in a minority parliament. And we're talking about misinformation here, and the need to trust, who we can trust, worried about what we see online. But here we have CTV News. We all know who CTV News is, and they created a statement. They spliced together multiple sentences to say something that the leader of the opposition did not say. Conservatives were calling for a carbon tax election. They made it about something else. So how damaging is this to Canadians' confidence in trusted sources if They can't trust that a major news outlet will just simply report on what's actually being said by the leader of the opposition, and instead deliberately editing a clip to have him say something that he never said.
Mr. Kolga, do you want to start with him?
Sure.
Okay, Mr. Kolga, and then we'll go to Mr. Bengio. You've got 2 minutes to respond.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm an expert on foreign information and influence operations, not on CTV's editorial policies. But I would agree that it's very important that Canadians are able to trust their media sources, especially in these times where trust is declining in media. But again, I'm an expert in foreign influence and information operations, not on these sorts of domestic situations.
I mean, it looks to me like they took it straight from the playbook from foreign entities that look to sow disinformation in our country. To the second witness.
I'm even farther away from this question, being an expert in AI. Sorry.
Yeah, it's I think that we have a real problem in our country. You know, we're looking outside to examine the effects of interference, of misinformation, of disinformation, and this is an example of disinformation. This is something that demonstrably did not occur. That they edited together. We talk about deepfakes. They didn't use AI. They used an editing suite to create a lie, and it's shocking. It's really low tech, actually. It's low tech domestic disinformation, and the fact that that organization is heavily subsidized by the Trudeau government, and then took to undermine the leader of the opposition on the eve of a confidence vote, I think tells us something very scary about interference in our democratic institutions by the powerful who favor Justin Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Fisher, we'll start with you, and then I understand we're going to go to Ms. Khalid to finish off your 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank both of our esteemed witnesses for not only being here today in their testimony, but for being patient with our committee, because I know you've been here before and we had votes and some things going on. So thank you so much for being here today. Artificial intelligence, foreign interference, misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes. Last witnesses were talking about lost trust in media, lack of critical thinking skills. People just don't know what to believe or who to believe and who to trust. I had a conversation with a neighbor one time, and she told me she no longer watches news at all. Whether she sees it on social media or whether she sees it on TV, she now, and this is kind of heartbreaking, she consciously goes out of her way to not watch any news because she's been duped by misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation in news. Last hour, we asked our witnesses to give us some recommendations. How do we get back to a place where people in my constituency can feel that they can trust the news again? I would ask Mr. Bengio first, and understanding, Mr. Kolga, that may not fall within your exact level of expertise. I would value your opinion as well.
So I'm going to say the same thing I said earlier and that I told the U.S. Senate a year ago, which is we need to stop with our international partners, but we can do our share here. We can stop the practice of anonymous social media accounts that allow foreign interference, that allow even AI to, be using thousands of accounts in a way that makes it difficult, but not just to trace them and take them down, but also eventually to get to jail the people who are doing things that go against our laws. And the reason they're, not asking, what your bank asks when you open an account is that they don't want to make it difficult for you to create an account because they make money on, having more people and, want to make it easy, and they compete with other companies. But if we had laws, and it is technically possible to protect privacy So, other users won't know necessarily who you are, but the government with, the appropriate mandate could. And, there are, I think, a number of researchers in the world that are thinking about how to do that. There are technical solutions, and we should go in that direction.
I would only add that we should look to Europe. We should look to the Digital Services Act. It is very effective in Europe. Well, I wouldn't say very effective. It is effective. It is a step in the right direction. Europe is making progress in terms of holding these social media companies to account, specifically for the content that's posted on their sites. We need to basically replicate that in this country. We should also look to our European allies like Finland, who have done an extremely good job of ensuring that future generations do have the digital media literacy skills they need in order to enable that sort of critical thinking. They inject digital media literacy into every course in every year within the school curriculum. It's not just one course a year or one class a year. It's throughout the entire education of a child from kindergarten to high school. They are learning about digital media literacy. So this is something that we should also be doing, and we need to start disrupting these sorts of activities, especially when it comes to foreign influence and interference, foreign influence and information operations. We need to figure out ways to disrupt these activities. Our European allies are doing this. We need to look to them again and learn from them how they're doing it and replicate those efforts here. Because if we're not disrupting these operations, if we're not holding those to account who are collaborating with these foreign regimes, then we're not going to move towards deterrence of them. So those are my 3 points.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fisher. We got 20 seconds left, Ms. Khalid. I looked over at Mr. Fisher. I do have a question I do want to ask, so I hope you'll indulge me here. First of all, let me say, Mr. Kolga and Mr. Bengio, that despite the technological problems that we had in the past, this was worth the wait. You've provided some valuable information to the committee. Whether we like to think so or not, sooner or later, we are going to have an election in this country, and the election is set for almost a year from today, so or sooner. And I want to hear from both of you, one with respect to foreign interference, the other, Mr. Bengio, with respect to artificial intelligence, the concerns that political parties and Canadians should have, and maybe some warning signs as we head into the next election. What are some of the things that we may be seeing down the pipe, if you will? Mr. Kolga, I'll start with you, and then we'll conclude with you, Mr. Bengio. Mr. Kolga?
I'll try to keep it brief.
I control the time, so you take your time. Because I think it's seriously, I think it's an important question that hasn't been asked at this point. Mr. Kolga.
Well, look, we have a smoking gun that came out of the U.S. with the DOJ indictment. $10 million was used to create a new platform with the help of Canadians to try and influence Canadian and American discourse. We see it happening, and so it's not a question of is something going to happen at the time of when the writ drops. It's already happening right now. And I think one of the problems that we have in this country is this belief that these foreign authoritarian regimes only activate themselves when there's an election. They don't. China and Russia are sophisticated. They engage in these sorts of operations well in advance of any election. It's 24/7 for them. The Russian government, for example, spends $3 billion a year on these operations. We're not even close. Even if you combine all NATO countries and their resources in terms of spending to challenge and defend against these operations, we're nowhere close. So we see it's happening, and I think that we need to sort of step back and acknowledge the fact that it's not just election; it's a full-time operation. How are we going to defend against that?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kolga. From a artificial intelligence perspective, now and into the future during an election, what are some of the things that we should be concerned about as we head into an election cycle, Mr. Bengio?
Okay, so we have to worry about the technology that already exists that can be used to create deep fakes of various kinds and imitate people, their voice, their visual appearance, their movements. And I think we need to start preparing against tools that are on the horizon. That could be, coming out in 6 months or something like this. Again, AI is not a static thing. It's getting better, as new systems and companies are coming up with new ways of training them that make them more competent. And I'm going to go into a little bit of a technical thing here, which is once one of these very large systems that cost over $100 million has been trained, it's fairly cheap to take it, especially if it's open source, and do a little bit more work to make it really good at one particular task. This is called fine-tuning. So you could imagine, for example, that the Russians might be taking Facebook's Llama and then making it run on social media, interact with people and see how well it works, and taking that data in order to make the system even better at convincing people to change their political opinion on some subject. As I said earlier, there are already studies showing that GPT-4, as it stands, is already better than humans, but only slightly, especially when it has access to your Facebook page. But it can get a lot worse without any new scientific breakthrough, just with a bit of engineering of the kind that they could easily do. And what that would mean is they can now unleash bots that would be, talking to potentially millions of people at the same time and trying to make them change their opinion. It's a kind of technology that we haven't seen, or maybe it is already happening and we're not aware of it, but it could be a game changer for elections in a bad way.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for providing such valuable information to the committee. That concludes today's meeting. I hope everybody has a great weekend. Thank you, Clerk, for arranging for our witnesses to be here. Mr. Kolga, Mr. Bengio, thank you for your valuable time today. That concludes today's meeting. I have no other business. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you next week.